Alright, here are your notes, section 1.4b. So let's underline that they're notes so that we know where to place them in our binder. We're going to put them in our notes section, and we can refer to them when we need some help. We're going to talk about two things. The first is absolute value, so let's circle that because that's one of the main topics. And then we're also going to talk about opposites. So first, absolute value, which we've spoken of earlier. Alright, by definition, you should know the definition already. It's the distance from zero. Distance from zero. So all you're really doing is you're counting your steps. You're counting the steps. How many steps does it take to get to your number if you start from zero? And it doesn't matter which direction you go. Alright, the symbol is two long lines, and sometimes they put a number in there or a variable. So let's put a variable in there. And all you say when you see this is you just say the absolute value of x. You're being asked, what is the absolute value in this case of x? How many steps away from zero are you? Alright, a couple things that you need to, or one important thing you need to make a note of. It's a grouping symbol. Absolute value is a grouping symbol. Just like parentheses or brackets or braces, fraction bar. And so that makes it come first. It's one of the first things you do in the order of operations. Okay? Alright, so an example. If I ask you for the absolute value of 8, all I'm asking you to do is count your steps. If you start at 0, how many steps does it take you to get to 8? It's going to take you 8 steps. Alright, if I ask you for the absolute value of negative 8, if you start at 0 and you walk towards negative 8 and you count your steps, it would take you 8 steps. Alright, so that was absolute value. Next is opposites. Opposites. So let's circle that, opposites. So it's the second major topic here. Alright, first the definition. Opposites are two different numbers and they're the same distance away from zero. Two different numbers that are the same distance away from zero. They are equal distances away from zero. But one's positive and one's negative because you go in opposite directions. So, but in opposite directions. So one's going to be positive and one's going to be negative. Okay? So one will be positive and one will be negative. For example, 10 and negative 10. You have one positive, one negative. They're both 10 steps away from 0, but for one of them you go to the right and the other number you go to the left. Another example would be negative 7 and 7. Those are opposites. They are both 7 steps away from 0, but you went in opposite directions. One more example might be 28 and negative 28. It gets a little tricky with algebra. So the symbol, believe it or not, is a negative sign. Okay, a negative sign. But when it's in front of a letter, how you say that, you don't say negative x, you say the opposite of x. So that algebra code, they're asking you to translate that as the opposite of x. That's what you're supposed to say when you see that. Okay, so for the essentials, let's just maybe draw a little picture here. Let's put 0 in the middle. And there's 2. And there's -2. And those are opposites. Both took you 2 steps to get from 0, but they're in opposite directions. Okay, let's try some examples. Let's try some algebra examples first. So number 1, if x equals 5, so that's important. If x equals 5, then find, okay, this is asking you for the opposite of x. That negative sign in front of a letter, when it's in front of a letter, you say opposite of x. So if x is 5, then we want the opposite of that, which should be -5. Okay, number 1b, it's asking you for the absolute value of x. The absolute value is how many steps away from 0. So if I'm at 5, how many steps did it take me to get there if I started at 0? 5 steps. Okay, so here's 0. If I want to get to 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, it takes me 5 steps. That's absolute value. And then if I'm looking for the opposite, I go the opposite direction. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now I'm at -5. All right, number 2. If x is -2, so I'm starting out with a negative, this first question is asking me to find the opposite of what I started with. So if I start with a negative number, -2, the opposite is going to be +2. All right, and then question B, absolute value. That's asking me how many steps does it take me to get to -2? How many steps does it take me? Just 2. So again, here's a picture. Here's 0. Here's -2. If I want the opposite of -2, I go in the opposite direction. If I want the absolute value, I just count my steps, 2 steps. All right, number 3, if x is -10, so if x is already negative, I start with a negative, and here I'm being asked what's the opposite of x. That's how you say that, opposite of what I started with. Since I started with a negative, the opposite is a positive. And then question B is just asking me how many steps did it take me to get to -10? How many steps does it take me? 10 steps. And then finally, number 4, if x is 8, this question here is asking me for the opposite of that. The opposite of +8 is -8. And this question is asking me how many steps did it take me to get to this original number. How many steps does it take me to get to 8? 8 steps. All right, a few more. Some math examples. So this time, no algebra, just math. All right, absolute value is a grouping symbol, so you take care of it first in a problem. So the first thing I do is the absolute value of -8, which is asking me how many steps does it take me to get to -8? It takes me 8 steps, but then I have to multiply that by 3, and 3 times 8 is 24. Number 2, do the absolute value first because it's a grouping symbol. Absolute value, how many steps does it take me to get to 7? It takes me 7 steps, and then there's a negative in front of it, so I just bring that along. That was weird. Absolute value seems like it turned out to be negative, but that's not true. The absolute value part was positive, and then you just bring down the negative, or the opposite. All right, number 3. Do the absolute value first. How many steps does it take you to get to -7? So if you start at 0 and you end up at -7, it took you 7 steps to get there, and then bring down the negative. So that negative just comes down, that opposite comes down. I did my absolute value first. Number 4, absolute value of 10. is 10 because it takes me 10 steps to get to 10. I then multiply by 4 and I get 40. Number 5, the absolute value of negative 4 is just 4 because it takes me 4 steps. That's what absolute value is asking, how many steps. And then bring down that negative, that opposite. And finally, I do the absolute value of 12, which is 12. Do that right away. And then bring down that negative, that opposite sign. Alright, last thing, graphing on a number line. Talked about this yesterday. So you draw your number lines need to have arrows. You need to equally space your marks as best you can. You don't necessarily have to get a ruler out, but try to be neat. Keep them equally spaced. Decide what you're going to count by. In this problem, I'm going to count by ones. I'm going to start with negative 8, negative 7, negative 6, negative 5, negative 4, negative 3, negative 2, negative 1, 0. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and then I put dots on the values. So the first one is negative 7. The next integer is 5, negative 3, 4, 0, 6, and negative 2. And now I can put them in order from least to greatest. Negative 7 is the smallest, then negative 3, then negative 2, then 0, then 4, then 5, then 6. Alright, I hope these notes are helpful.